Talk, Commander.
Commander, the engine is ready for activation. We can now stop the flow of time.
Things are not going well for— Whoa. Slow down. Let's roll the tape back a few days. The war on the Allied nations was coming to its turning point. The myriad of projects conveniently retaken by the Allies. Countless personnel and resources poured into their amplifier lures. So much had been wagered in exchange for this golden opportunity, and if it had succeeded, then all would have been worth the sacrifice. But even the most cunning mortal cannot escape the whims of the gods. At the height of their power, the climax of the battle, so close to victory, so close to erasing the Allies for good, all turned on its head by their enemy's ace in the hole. One far greater than the Irkala, the Paradox Engine. Rising out of the Steinstech hangar, the gargantuan warship instantly destroyed the Irkala, as well as the rest of the Epsilon forces nearby, before vanishing from the proselytes' prying eyes. The whole world had thought the Allies defeated, beaten and broken. But in truth, they had been secretly forging a sword meant for deicide, a spell that would shake the world as they all knew it. It is often the wisest among us who would be most affected by their intellectual failings, and for someone as calculating and visionary as Yuri, what had transpired in London had, to put it simply, devastated him. For the first time in his life, Yuri had felt his grasp for world domination shaken to its very core. This anomaly, whatever it is, has the potential to become Epsilon's undoing, and its immediate destruction has all but eclipsed any other priorities Yuri had in mind. A failure though it may be in the end, the surprise assault on the London fortress still managed to cripple its industrial zones in the process. With nearly all of their labs and assemblies destroyed, the Allied production line is essentially paralyzed, making it nigh impossible for them to withstand prolonged attacks, which is exactly what Yuri needs to corner the Allies into a bad position. Now that their ultimate weapon is revealed to him, the Epsilon leader has summoned all the naval forces he could spare to join the attack on the British Isles, an ever-growing kindling to the flames of war that have engulfed its coasts. The oxidizers provided by Rashidi proved surprisingly effective against the Thor battle groups that protect the Gladius nodes, and these Epsilon elites, members of his psychic division who have elevated their psionic abilities enough to levitate through telekinesis, quickly assimilated the Trident battleships into Epsilon's ranks. Should the Allies remain confined to the Isles, then it won't be long, even with the help of their new superweapon, before one of the Gladius nodes are taken down. And since the Allies are operating under the assumption that Yuri still holds one Midas in his hands, to them, it is only natural to expect a nuclear warhead at their doorsteps should their Gladius system be breached. Therefore, the only reasonable response from the Allies would be to try to escape the British Isles with the Paradox Engine. A significant bulk of the Allied remnants flocked to their new warship, abandoning their posts to embark on an expedition away from the United Kingdom. The move was swift, and its decisive execution allowed them to outmaneuver the Psychor forces pursuing the engine, and they successfully breached the primary perimeter surrounding the United Kingdom. As expected, with the threat of amplifiers and beacons inland, it would be foolhardy for the expedition force to chart a course anywhere but onto open waters. The easiest path through which to break out of the encirclement completely then will be the Isles of Scilly. Eager to absolve himself of his mistake as soon as possible, Yuri ordered his men to hastily form a new blockade against the expeditionary force. Multiple Gehenna platforms were ferried onto the Isles, their onboard Debrick interceptors calibrated beforehand to specifically target the Paradox Engine. With Psychor forces following closely behind the fleeing fleet, Yuri had hoped that this would be enough to stop the engine for good. But the Allied superweapon was not the only thing they needed to look out for. Utilizing a mass-produced version of Siegfried's Chrono Backpack, members of the newly formed Chrono Legion, each handpicked from their squad for their exceptional physical and mental capabilities, had arrived ahead of the expedition to deal with the Gehenna platforms. Armed with a miniaturized version of the Charon tank's neutron cannon, these Chrono Legionnaires easily exploited the lack of anti-personnel measures taken by the Epsilon forces, erasing their anti-air units one after another until none were left. Yuri placed his hopes on the warships that still remained, ready to put up a fight still against the Allies. But all that optimism disappeared as soon as the engine itself arrived on the scene. The battlefield feed suddenly cut off, restoring minutes later only to broadcast the ruined husks of his destroyed fleet. And the formidable engine was now nowhere to be seen, an outcome most resemblant to how the Irkala was felled. And that was the moment Yuri truly understood the gravity of the situation. And so we return to the present. Things are not going well for Yuri. Ooh, definitely not well. Everywhere the engine goes, the skies darken for their foes. Ever since the launch of that improbable ship, the Epsilon army has suffered extensive damage to their bases along the Atlantic coastline, most notably on the Iberian Peninsula and in North Africa. Dozens of bases destroyed, numerous agents eliminated. Not much time has passed, and yet the Paradox expedition has already cemented itself as the force to be reckoned with. Subsequent attempts to take down the engine all ended in failure, with each engagement best described as a one-sided stomp. Every time the engine appeared, the Epsilon forces present there would be inexplicably wiped out in an instant, with naught but their smoldering remains left thereafter. Several speculations have been formulated, but their intel on the engine's abilities is pathetically inadequate to back up any plausible hypothesis. The data sent back by the mind readers, which the Epsilon army relied upon heavily to gather its battlefield intelligence, only exacerbated the confusion. Nothing out of the ordinary at first, then all of a sudden, the readings flatline, as if the device's signals were frozen, quite literally, in time. Most would then be destroyed before their systems came back online, and the few that do survive would instead return readings that were drastically different to the ones from minutes prior. As unthinkable as the idea may be, all evidence points to the possibility that the Paradox engine may have harnessed the ability to tamper with time itself. That thought alone is terrifying enough, but its threat is further compounded by the Allies' extended ability to rapidly chronoshift their forces right into even the most fortified strongholds. It's likely that the chronosphere rebuilt by the Allies after the Third Great War is embedded directly onto their new mobile headquarters, which would explain why the attack on the London fortress failed to locate the superweapon. Perhaps if Yuri were to seize what remains of the Steinstech hangar, he might be able to gather more insight into the inner workings of the Paradox engine. But the Allies, the ones left behind to protect the British Isles, fought on with the same level of ferocity and stubbornness as their expeditionary counterparts, fortifying every inch of the road that stretched from the coast to the London fortress. And without the Irkala, an attack from within using the old chronosphere won't yield any results either. A slow crawl towards the fortress is the only option, but it's one Yuri must take no matter what. Anything, everything that could help defeat the engine, he will clutch onto them, be they straws or ropes. With what little they know about the engine as of right now, the prospect of a victory through conventional means is about as likely as a blue moon. The balance of power has been broken. Hell, the whole scale has been thrown out the window. And if he is to have a real chance at defeating the Paradox engine, he may be forced to bring out his own trump card much earlier than he would like to. One that is far from complete, but he realistically has no other options available. This odyssey which the Allies have embarked on, if not stopped in time, will eventually find its way into the beating heart of Epsilon. In a way, Yuri's situation now mirrors that of the Allies from not so long ago, to delay their foes for as long as they could, until their ace is ready. And the weeks ahead will make Yuri truly understand the weight of such a task. The Iberian Peninsula was the first to fall, with the Allies moving in and out of Epsilon bases almost instantaneously with their chronosphere and the suspected time freeze ability. Large bases, small outposts reduced to atoms in split seconds. What the Allies couldn't destroy in the span of a single time freeze, they instead froze with the cryocopter, a newly developed aircraft utilizing a sophisticated variant of the Blizzard tank's cryobeam to draw out heat from its target until they were rendered brittle and immobile. Countermeasures were nigh impossible to set up, and their coastal bases were crushed without gaining much in return. In a desperate attempt to prevent the Allies from constructing outposts in Spain and Portugal, the genetic research team at Zaragoza abandoned the facility as part of a scorched earth tactic, relocating their equipment and personnel before overloading the cloning vats they retook from the Soviets. The resulting viral outbreak of an infectious strain of the Terra Nova virus has rendered a large region around the city completely inhospitable to human life, dissuading any plans by the Allies to push further inland. Next came North Africa, with both Psychor and Scorpion Cell losing many of their bases in Morocco. While the numerous cell settlements inland would provide a solid buffer against the fierce Allied attacks, their facilities close to the Atlantic coast quickly fell into hot water. Self-destruct protocols were hastily added to as many existing beacons as possible, lest they be captured and used by the Allies like they did in Italy. Such measures did little to stifle the loss of their territories against the Allied rampage, however. Having fully developed and assembled a squadron of the prototype Barracudas they retook from Yuri, the Allied Air Force used these untraceable stealth bombers to quickly disintegrate any psychic beacons they came upon. The newfound Allied Chrono Legion only adds more salt to the wound, continuously sabotaging any plans to erect new beacons on the fly. Several bases that relied heavily upon mind-controlled American troops were taken out almost instantaneously as a result, with scarcely any recourse available at all. Such cases were many, not only bolstering the Allied expedition's strength gradually, but also rapidly opening new paths towards the cell's more vulnerable settlements. One of which, a research facility located in Tudra Valley, Morocco, was now under direct attack by the Paradox engine. The facility housed several new prototypes near completion, prompting Rashidi to immediately request help from Yuri. The quivering tone in his voice was proof enough that even the cell's leader was trembling in fear of this new Allied superweapon, and Yuri promptly dispatched the proselyte to Rashidi's aid. One of the facility's prototypes contains an important piece of his research that can change the outcome of the war, and Yuri would not be suffered to tolerate more setbacks. Higher the stakes for this battle, but by the time the proselyte arrived, the primary Scorpion cell base in the area had already fallen to a blitz attack by the Allies. A pincering Allied task force approached from behind, quickly closing in on the facility. Reinforcements were limited, and the only forces defending their assets were mind-controlled Americans. Thinking quickly on their feet, the proselyte made the decision to evacuate the prototypes through their underground tunnels, amassing a rolling tide of flesh to halt the Allied advance. Unaware of the prototype's importance, the Allies placed their attention on destroying the psychic beacon controlling the Americans nearby. By the time they did so, the proselyte had already brute forced their way through the savannah, crawling with Mirage tanks and snipers. With the prototypes secured, the remaining forces quickly retreated into the dunes. Whatever remains can be left to the Allies for all they care. Once the creation is deployed, their reclamation will soon be put to an end.
Proselyte, our troops in the United States are facing increasing
For Yuri's
complications.
sake, man, could you give me some good news for once?
The advent of the new Allied superweapon was nothing short of pure misery for Yuri, and boy does misery love company. Growing larger with every passing moment, the Amplifier's waves have now stretched far and wide across the United States, affecting numerous Epsilon positions across the country. Although some thankfully have the means to negate its influence with their own psychic beacons, most were forced to desert their posts and retreat from their territories. This allowed the Soviets to rapidly regroup their forces on the continent, creating large breakthroughs in enemy formation, eventually cleaning up nearly all Epsilon regiments operating in the West Coast. While they seemingly regained the upper hand, however, the Soviet general is fully aware of the shaky foundation their advantage is built upon, the Chicago Amplifier, the critical device which the Soviets' current success hinges entirely upon, the loss of which would quickly put them back on the defensive again. To address this shortcoming, the Soviet general immediately launched several encirclement attacks on the surrounding beacons, aiming to either destroy or capture them to consolidate their hold over the US psychic network. With a substantial amount of mind-controlled US rebels at their disposal, it's likely that a few beacons will be wrested away from Epsilon control at the bare minimum. And that wasn't even the end of Yuri's headaches, for the Soviets weren't the only ones vying for control over the beacons. The remaining American remnants, split off into multiple smaller groups, are fleeing from the Amplifier's influence as well. One of their larger task forces heading towards the city of Boston had managed to reclaim an old comm station in the pursuit of their quest, and successfully established contact with the Paradox expedition roaming the Atlantic coasts. Using some of their in-development tech as a bargaining chip, the rebels successfully convinced the undermanned Paradox expedition to chrono-shift some of their forces in as reinforcements. The advanced units at their disposal allowed them to successfully capture a psychic beacon deployed in Boston, mind-controlling the Epsilon forces within as well. This contingent of American remnants soon realized they had unknowingly struck gold, however, as this seemingly ordinary Epsilon base was in fact a research facility that was developing a prototype superweapon for Yuri, designed to be capable of emitting sonic blasts that can cause wholesale decimation in a large radius, and is planned to be incorporated into the Epsilon army en masse once finished. This information was relayed to the expeditionary forces, who sent further reinforcements on site to aid the rebels. In the wake of the Paradox engine's rampage, the destructive capabilities of this prototype superweapon would serve as a most effective deterrent, and losing it will be yet another devastating hit to the Epsilon army. The loss of a highly anticipated superweapon, and the looming fear of total defeat at the hands of the Soviet general in America. To say Yuri was worried would be a severe understatement. These are dark times for the Epsilon army, and even the great leader himself holds little confidence in their odds of success. But such are the hardships one must overcome to achieve divinity, for it is within the crucible of adversity that one's faith is tested, and his followers' unwavering devotion to the cause would miraculously snatch victory for Yuri from the abyssal jaws of defeat.
Hail to the great Yuri.
Following their introduction in the European theater, the Magnetron and Mastermind had finally been integrated into the Epsilon arsenal in America as well. Not only capable of pulling buildings apart, these hovercrafts could also reverse the polarity of their weapons when needed, rooting their enemies in place as their new defense towers incinerated the magnetized victims. Those left behind were summarily mind-controlled by the Masterminds, stonewalling any and all Soviet and Allied aggression at every turn. This new factor in the equation allowed the Epsilon army to strike back at their enemies, kickstarting counterattacks on multiple fronts. Since the Amplifier's range is still a long way from reaching Boston, the Epsilon commanders in charge of retaking the base decided not to recapture, but to destroy the psychic beacon instead, saving them ample trouble as they freed the friendly forces nearby. Caught off guard by this surprising move, the American remnants quickly lost control of the research facility. The Epsilon commanders quickly took the reins from the local garrison, mounting a counteroffensive on the American outposts. With the situation quickly turning south for the rebels, a slew of chrono reinforcements were promptly sent into the area, relentlessly attacking the facility in hopes of destroying the incomplete superweapon. These haphazard chrono shifts were calibrated too close to the facility, however, and were turned on their heads by the defenders who mind-controlled the reinforcements as soon as they materialized. Despite the rebels' best efforts, the Epsilon army ultimately managed to fend off the attacks, turning the Americans' own against them as they leveled their bases in the area, ensuring the safety of Yuri's prototype superweapon. With the rebels on the retreat and the only device capable of turning the situation around destroyed, the Paradox Expedition's chrono shifts eventually ceased, leaving those who remained to fend for themselves. Elsewhere on the continent, the Soviet aggression began meeting greater resistance as well, with many targeted strikes on psychic beacons neutralized by the insidious masterminds. Though often prone to being overwhelmed by superior numbers, this glaring weakness of these artificial brains is far less pronounced in a defensive scenario, where the mind-controlled units are sent into a grinder before they could overload the mastermind's neural circuits. Most Soviet operations, even those backed by mind-controlled Americans, yielded little fruits as a result. Some were met with worse fates, like the task force assigned to capture the Detroit beacon, who not only failed to complete their objective despite deploying several Iron Curtain devices, but also perished entirely from the ensuing counterattack, nearly costing the life of the Soviet general who was overseeing the battle nearby as well. Such fierce displays of fervent zeal had surprised not only Yuri, but the Soviet general as well. Seeing firsthand the firm grasp the Epsilon army still held over their parts of the continent, a seed of doubt was beginning to sprout within the general's mind. The recent efforts to retake the SSA have clearly started to stagnate, and may very well amount to nothing more than further casualties. With South America now completely in Yuri's hands, things may take a dire turn for them yet. The Amplifier continues to stand as their only defense against Yuri's psychic network. Should it fall, their hold over the west coast would likely crumble soon after as well. To continue relying on the Amplifier would be a foul move, and it is imperative that they find an alternative. Most fortunate for them, then, that an urgent message would manage to reach the general's ears at such a time, one originating from their old allies in the Far East. In a most unlikely twist of events, the Russians received an auspicious offer from the Chinese government to re-establish good relations between the countries, with the end goal of combining their forces in the battle against Yuri. Strange, for the PRC, through unknown means, has managed to remain as the one entity least affected by Yuri's actions thus far. To openly invite an enemy into their midst right now is a perplexing decision to say the least. Though as outlandish as the idea may be, it isn't as unexplainable as it sounds. The war in Eurasia may have finally made them realize the threat Yuri poses, or perhaps they simply want more fodder to help push back the Epsilon influence in Southeast Asia. Regardless of their true intentions, the fact remains that China intends to once again, even if temporarily, form a united front with the rest of the Soviet Union. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and with the sorry state they're left in after Yuri's uprising, the Soviets are more than willing to push aside past transgressions and reform their alliance. All differences, even if temporarily, must be put behind them all to deal with the greater threat. With all that being said, however, the suspicious circumstances surrounding the offer aren't something to be ignored either. Should the opportunity end up revealing itself as a trap to eliminate what's left of the Soviet command chain, then the Reds would do well to take the precaution of ensuring otherwise. As such, after preliminary talks with the PRC leadership, the Soviets agreed to hold negotiations in the neutral country of Singapore, away from both Russian and Chinese soil. While this ensures the two sides can't play any tricks on each other, its remoteness also opens the negotiations up for sabotage from Yuri, who is most definitely not going to stand idly by. With several SEA members of the Pacific Front still alive and kicking, however, they should be at least somewhat effective at disrupting Yuri's troop deployments. And with a significant portion of the Chinese Pacific Fleet stationed in their new naval base in the Philippines, the chosen location is as perfect of a middle ground as one can hope for. Having decided their course of action, the Comrade General rallied their remaining forces in North America to the west coast, conducting a mass exodus as they left the protection of the Amplifier solely to the mind-controlled forces. With the psychic device tying their enemies down, and the protection offered by the Confederation Navy in Pearl Harbor, their journey to the Far East was thankfully a smooth sail, allowing them to pick up the pace with the peace talks. As part of the pre-negotiation, a degree of intel exchange and tech sharing was facilitated between the two parties, in addition to the release of various Chinese POWs ahead of the meeting, captured during their invasion of Podmorsky Krai 2 years ago. The successful release of these prisoners is a non-negotiable term in the peace talks, forcing the Russians to oblige. Because of a shortage of time, however, the Russians had no choice but to escort the prisoners through the shortest route possible, that being the region of Pogranichny, heavily contested by Psychor at the moment. Contact with multiple detachments in the area was recently lost, presumably mind-controlled by a psychic beacon nearby. To free these soldiers from their enemies' clutches would be ideal, but with their comms disrupted and the urgency of the situation at hand, any methodical approaches had to be brushed aside in favor of simpler tactics. The duo Volkov and Chitskoy were sent in for assistance, slaughtering many of their own men as they brute forced their way through the ambushes. The prisoners were successfully delivered, and the Epsilon presence in the area was summarily removed. Nevertheless, even with the POWs offered as a sign of goodwill, the amount of topics in contention still means that the peace talks would be a long and arduous affair. A fight with the Epsilon is inevitable. As such, a significant amount of Soviet and Chinese troops were deployed in the aforementioned city-state, forming a large blockade around the Congress of Singapore, with the last line of defense held by none other than the Soviet general, who hastily established a perimeter around the Congress building, utilizing both Confederation and Russian equipment, as well as blueprints shared by the Chinese. But before their preparations could complete, the Epsilon army had reached the outskirts of Singapore, descending upon the city with an armada from all directions, with mind-controlled puppets mixed into the fray as well. Stretched thin and with misplaced barrels laid out all over their defenses, the Chinese positions crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes, giving the invaders a clear path towards the city. Following their explosive entrance, the Epsilon army launched a rapid naval assault in the south, spearheaded by their newest invention, the Marauder tanks, featuring anti-gravity plates for swift amphibious travel, as well as a pyrokinetic beam cannon able to punch holes into the thickest armor. Its speedy offensive easily penetrated the Soviet generals' coastal defenses, only stopped once they reached deeper into the city, where they're mown down by the Chinese hammer defenses, its firing mechanism generating a wave of seismic activity by pounding a large column of steel into the ground, which is then steered directly towards incoming tanks before turning them into scrap metal. The infantry who can shrug off the bullets with little harm are instead met with accompanying armored forces, who are shielded from harm themselves by the Iron Guards. Such head-on confrontations are clearly not the Epsilon army's forte, and with the Soviet general directing the defense efforts, their advances quickly slowed down to a crawl. With the key choke points defended by the Chinese broken through, however, the battle only grew more difficult over time for the Soviets, with wave after wave of Epsilon forces approaching at a steady rate. Their persistence whittled the fortified defenders down little by little, pushing deeper into the city center as time went on. Thankfully, the Russian heroes Volkov and Chitskoy managed to arrive in time, followed by Moratis and his elite Confederation guards. The addition of the Soviet heroes renewed the defenders' morale, earning them precious minutes until the conclusion of the negotiation talks. Eventually, the main Chinese reinforcements arrived to evacuate the generals, just before the total collapse of the final defense line. Having repelled the persistent Epsilon forces led by Ron, the Soviet general smiled knowing that he brought the Union one step closer to their glorious victory. The formidable PRC, hand in hand once again with the Soviets. Yuri's life is as good as forfeit before their combined might. Well, if only fate was so kind to its victims. Whew, that sure was a hard-won battle. Good thing it was worth all the effort. Now that the Alliance is reformed, we'll retake our homeland from Yuri in no time. Wait a minute, where's that music coming from?
Sorry to ruin your recent victory, General, but we have failed to reach an agreement with the Chinese.
What the f-